Fire Away tackles burning questions and hot topics in Canadian employment law, human resources, and dispute resolution. Hosted by Rudner Law, Fire Away is your go-to source for legal insight on the world of work. So whether you are an employee or an employer, a lawyer or an HR pro, let's ignite the conversation and get into today's episode. Here's your host, employment lawyer, mediator, and founder of Rudner Law, Stuart Rudner.
Welcome to episode 101 of Fire Away. Today, I'm very excited to have as my guest Daniel Miskin of Miskin Law. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us on Fire Away.
Hey, Stuart. Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you. And today we're going to be talking about workplace safety with a bit of a focus on asbestos exposure and occupational cancer, because that is a particular focus of Daniel's practice. He has helped hundreds of families secure compensation through trust claims, through legal settlements, through litigation, including some cross-border recovery, which I'm also interested in asking about as we go. Daniel is also known to maintain one of Canada's most comprehensive proprietary databases of asbestos products and job sites. And those of you who are really paying attention to Fireway will notice he is the second guest from Miskin Law. And this marks the first time we have had a father and son both as guests. So hopefully this will be a tremendous source of pride in the Miskin family. Before we get started, Daniel, I just wanted to mention we recently celebrated our 100th episode, and I was scrolling through YouTube last night and noticed that we are very close to 1,000 subscribers. I think we were at 983. So if you are enjoying our podcast, please like, follow, and subscribe on whichever platform you're using so we can get up to 1,000 subscribers. So Daniel, let's talk a bit about your practice first of all. How did you get into that area of practice?
So I work with my dad, as you know, and he did a little bit of everything. He's been a lawyer since 1981. So back then you had to do everything. You couldn't just do one area of law. So he would do estates and real estate and personal injury, a little business, a little criminal. And then in the early 2000s, he started working on these asbestos cases with another firm in the US. So when I graduated in law school and started to work with him, I tried a little bit of everything out. I tried a little personal injury, a little wills and estates, and but I was drawn to the asbestos claims, and it's because I felt like I could help people the most, and it was the most fulfilling. So since then, the past 11 years, I've been, consistently working on just asbestos cases. And back when he started, it was all paper files. So I took everything on the computer and made databases and took everything online, basically. So, since I talk to people every day with terminal cancer that, worked all over Canada, and many of them are in industrial sites. So I've been able to create this database that you mentioned. If they remember specific products that were made with asbestos at a certain plant, I'll get information from a boiler worker or a pipe fitter or an electrician about what they remember at each location. So this database has got, thousands of sites now across Canada and details about what it was like working there.
That's very cool. So is that database something that members of the public can access?
No, it's really for my helping my clients. So, for example, say I get a client that worked at Stelco in Hamilton, and they tell me all about what it was like, and now I have evidence of specific products, who made the boilers and the pipe insulation and the gaskets. So if I have another client that has passed away, so a widow contacts me and says, my husband worked at Stelco, they can't provide evidence because he's passed away. So the only other option is to find a coworker or rely on my database where we know about the other products that were there.
Great. That's
So
a
this is
fantastic
helping
tool.
future clients. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it because the reality is I see it in cases we handle, and we're not typically handling that type of case, but sometimes there's some similarities. And the challenge we often run into is we don't have that evidence. Nobody knows what
Yeah.
was there, what was done, when it was done. So yeah, that database sounds like it could
And
be
that
a
happens all the
really great
time. I have
resource.
clients that, we don't know what products were at the site that they worked at. I don't have every single site, or say someone worked in a residential home, we may never know in some cases.
Right. No, that's a great tool. And yeah, I think another reason why people should go to you if they have these issues, because they're probably being much better, have a much stronger case than they would with another lawyer who didn't have all that data available.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been doing it for 20 years and consistently having clients tell us about different work sites. So I've had, thousands of work sites and also jobs, things I've never heard of before, but I've probably had every single job you can imagine from, millwrights to teachers and plumbers, and then things like a roustabout or a farrier, someone who makes the horseshoes. There was asbestos in the furnaces and things like that. They'd be making their horseshoes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I'd love to get the list of jobs at some point from you because that would be pretty cool to see. And well, you said roastabout. I got to ask, what is a roastabout?
You know what? I can't remember at the moment, but
Right.
that it's just one of the ones that sticks with me.
Yeah. So I shouldn't have put you on the spot there.
Yeah. What is a roast about? I can't remember this.
All right. Well, we can always come back to that, but I
Entry-level
am curious.
manual labor who performs heavy, unskilled physical work, commonly offshore oil and gas drilling rigs. So I've definitely had a few roastabouts. Yeah.
I see Mark, who most people know as our producer, as roastabout as a carny worker. That's
Yeah.
another another definition. I actually would have assumed it was someone who just kind of like pushing along and not someone working. So
Hmm.
what do I know? So what's I mean, obviously, people always ask me this question. I always sort of stumble over the answer, but of course, I'll ask you the same question. Like, what's the typical type of case that you're working on?
Most of the cases are for men over 65. They worked their career at a factory or many different locations. And, they might have just retired or they've been retired for 10 years. And then they're diagnosed with terminal cancer, mesothelioma. So, most of them are industrial type workers. But lately we've been seeing different trends where we're getting a lot of female clients. And
Hmm.
our female clients are often exposed through a family member, such as their father or their husband. And that's when they'd be, shaking out their dusty work clothes. And this is back 50 years ago. Nowadays, you don't bring your dusty work clothing back home for your wife to wash, but that was the case in the 60s, 70s, even 80s. And sometimes the worker doesn't get cancer, but his wife does.
Right.
Or, lately we've had a lot of female clients that are young, and this is sad to see because, the majority of people are over 65 getting
Okay.
mesothelioma. But in the past 2 years, we've had a lot of young women and sometimes they have no idea where they were exposed. And that is what leads me to believe it could be from talcum powder. So where they mine talc, there's veins of asbestos, and companies that sold talc products like Johnson and Johnson baby powder, they knew their baby powder was tainted with asbestos, like
Okay.
maybe 0.01%, but that is enough. There's no safe
Hmm.
level of asbestos. So, in the past couple of years, we've been getting about 10, 20 young women with no possible occupational exposures. And, that leads me to believe it must be from talc. And it's not just baby powder, but there's other cosmetics like foundation and blush and different cosmetic makeup products that contain talc as well. So we've had some cases against Johnson and Johnson and a lot of different makeup companies that had asbestos contaminated talc in their products.
Wow. And you said they had, but are there still makeup companies that use talc or asbestos contaminated talc?
Yes. I heard a study of somebody tested all the makeup at Claire's, and about 50% of it had asbestos.
Wow.
So it's pretty scary, especially the cheaper products, that might come from China. There might be talc in it, and now a lot of it's
Hmm.
being marketed as talc free. So,
Right.
I immediately wanted to see, does my daughter have any, weird makeups that I wouldn't want her to be using, and my wife, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Also, another reason I don't wear makeup.
Yeah.
But
Well, not
that,
everyone, everyone has exposure to asbestos, but not everyone gets cancer from it, and not everyone gets, a lung disease from it.
okay.
So, sometimes you wonder, like I said, with the husband that works with the asbestos every day, putting pipes in a plant and and then his wife gets it. So you got to
Right.
wonder why
Right.
some people get it and some people don't.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
was also wondering how they're putting the pieces together. So your example of a guy who's, 65, 70, he's probably been retired now for a few years, and all of a sudden he's diagnosed with cancer. How do they
Mhm.
typically put things together and realize that this came from the workplace?
It's normally their doctor. When they are diagnosed with mesothelioma, they'd say, "Oh, did you work with asbestos?" Or if they're trying to figure out a person, when somebody has cancer, they'll ask them, did you work with asbestos? Things like that. And that can lead to them testing for mesothelioma versus a different type of lung cancer that's not from asbestos.
I see.
So mesothelioma is only caused by asbestos. So it makes my job easy because we know exactly where it came from. Other types of cancer, they can be hereditary or from smoking or environmental, but this
Right.
one type of cancer, mesothelioma, is only from asbestos. And it can be in your lungs or your abdomen or your heart. There's Most of them have it in their lungs, pleural mesothelioma, but there's also in the abdomen, which is peritoneal. And about 10% of my clients have peritoneal, and they often live longer. There's a surgery, the HIPEC surgery, where a lot of them are able to scrape out the tumors and get it out. But the average lifespan for someone with mesothelioma is often 6 months to a year. But I have clients that are alive 12 years later at the same time.
Hmm.
It's rare, but the younger ones are often healthier going into it.
All right. A lot of our discussion was sort of about the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that kind of thing. But are you seeing cases where people have been exposed in recent times?
Yes, my youngest client was born, I think it was 2002, and he
Oh
was
wow.
14 when he was diagnosed. And the only thing we could think of was baby powder. Um, And so I've had another one diagnosed at 19. So this is all in the 2000s,
Got
that
it.
that they're born. So they had to be exposed now.
Right.
And like say you're doing a renovation of your home, you're tearing down some walls and putting up drywall or, maybe putting a fan in the ceiling. There could be asbestos if it's an older house, if there's plaster. So workers are still being exposed.
Right. Got
Yeah.
it. And what about like the workplaces, like we were talking about initially? I mean, there's still a lot of those workplaces that have the risk of asbestos contamination, or has that been largely eliminated?
Largely eliminated, I would say, due to work safety. And, there's so much red tape. If they find asbestos in a plant or a school or something like that, it's really cordoned off and there's a lot of abatement. But the government said, just paint over it. If you have asbestos pipe, paint over it because abatement is very expensive.
Hmm.
But at the same time, if you don't do it and then someone unknowingly disturbs it, then they're getting exposed and exposing everyone in the building.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is you mentioned a couple of examples, but I was hoping you might have some other examples of clients that you've encountered and helped over the years.
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, we had a young woman who was 39, and her dad worked in construction and he worked as a welder as well, and they did home renovations. So when she was a baby, they were renovating their home, and she was crawling around on the floor, and it was dusty from the renovation. And then, 39 years later, she has this mesothelioma, and it was peritoneal mesothelioma. So she did have surgery, and they took out half of her intestines, but she's still alive today, 12 years later,
Oh
and
wow.
we're good friends, and we still talk. And we went to the Blue Jay game with her and her son a few years back,
Nice.
and she's our longest living client, and she got to meet her grandkids. So this is a
Nice.
happy story. I have plenty that they just retired, they're 65, they're looking forward to their retirement, and then they're diagnosed. And,
Right.
you know, and they don't live very long. Most people, it could be 6 months, it could be 2 or 3 years,
Right.
but most people don't make it past 2 or 3 years. So, as I mentioned, all my clients are terminal. They're dying of cancer. And, for the 39-year-old, they told her she has 6 months to live.
Right.
And
Yeah. But I guess it goes to show you that they
12
never
years
really know for
later,
sure.
she made it. Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
the clients that live the longest, I think they keep a good attitude. I think that's what helps the most. I mean, there's treatment, there's chemotherapy, radiation, and immunotherapy.
Okay.
Very rarely do I have clients have surgery. There is a surgery in Toronto where they remove your entire lung and
Oh
they go
well.
through the back, and not most people aren't eligible for the surgery. If it's spread, if it's spread to the other lung, they're not going to do it. They can also remove, if it's localized to the lining of the lung, the pleura, then they can sometimes remove that. But most people aren't able to get surgery.
Right. No, I mean, look, it's got weird. I know we were talking about this before we started recording. It's got to be incredibly difficult. I mean, it's hard enough working with clients who've just lost their job, although you've now given me another argument when they talk about how devastating it is, and I try to be comforting and reassuring. I can tell them it could be a lot worse, and
You
talk
could
about
have
the clients
cancer.
that you're working
Yeah.
with.
Yeah, so every day I talk to someone that's dying of cancer or a widow that's crying on the phone, and I wear many hats. I sometimes I'm their therapist, sometimes I'm
Yeah.
their lawyer, sometimes I'm grilling them about their work, and
Yeah.
I have to know about a steel plant and a chemical plant and the equipment in there. So it is, you know, a lot of different things that I'm doing just to bring this all together. And a lot of it is estate issues as well, because the person is
Yeah.
usually passes away and it goes to their beneficiaries or goes to their spouse. And if they die without a will, then it gets even trickier. Sometimes we can't order medical records.
Oh,
But as you were saying, there is an emotional somewhat, it can be tolling.
yeah.
But it's also fulfilling when I'm able to help these families, usually in their worst time of their life. Diagnosed with terminal cancer is probably the worst thing that can happen to you,
Yeah,
especially,
a lot worse than losing
yeah,
your job. Even though losing your job is not easy, but
yeah.
I often say, our team, we often feel like therapists. I'm sure it's even more so in your case. But I'm curious, and I think a lot of people watching and listening will be curious as well. Like when you talk about helping these people, what does that actually look like? What are the remedies that they would be entitled to?
So I'm helping people financially, obviously, and no amount of money is worth dying for or what they're going through. It's an awful type of cancer where you're often just drowning in your own lungs because of the fluid buildup.
Well,
So in terms of compensation, we what we normally do in most of our cases is file a claim to the asbestos trusts. And you might have seen on TV, 30 billion available. It's not that simple. So there's companies that once sold asbestos products and they were sued into bankruptcy in US court. So
okay,
part of their bankruptcy agreement, it's a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, is that they had to set up a fund for people with mesothelioma and lung cancer and asbestosis and asbestos related diseases. So we file claims to these trusts. And, one company might have 100 million for every claim in the future. Another company might have 500 million. And, some trusts are bigger than others. And it's basically a judge that said, okay, you need to fund your trust with 500 million for the next 40 years for people to put in a claim. And, one person isn't getting 30 billion.
hmm,
But, we'll put in a claim to say five different companies.
okay,
Um, Such as Johns Manville. They owned asbestos mines in Quebec, and
okay,
they were one of the bigger companies. So we'll put in a claim to them. We'll submit evidence of medical evidence and exposure evidence, and
okay,
the claim will be reviewed and hopefully accepted. So over the years, we've gotten better at figuring out, what evidence is required. When I first started doing it, we'd say, oh, we worked here and he was exposed to X product. Well, they want to know how the person was exposed and how they remember it was this product. Because we're talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s, this is a long
right,
time ago. People have to probably haven't thought about what type of gaskets they were using 50 years ago.
right,
But often you remember if you're working with gaskets every day. You
yeah,
say, do you remember Garlock Gasket Company? And oh, I used Armstrong gaskets. And
right,
so we'll put in a claim to these asbestos trusts, and the more products that they remember, then the more claims we can file.
Oh,
So
I see. So I was wondering why you file multiple claims, but that explains it.
so it's a claim against, 5, 10, maybe 15 different companies that have this trust fund. So, I gave the example Stelco. They had boilers made by Babcock and Wilcox. So the boilers had asbestos in them, on them, around them. And if someone worked at Stelco, then we put in a claim to Babcock and Wilcox, for example,
Got it. Okay.
with
And then
the
how
evidence
is,
that we get. Yeah.
I'm sure, your answer is going to be probably the typical lawyer's answer of it depends, but I mean, roughly speaking, how much could someone expect to recover if their claim is approved?
It really depends on where they worked. So if they are doing residential construction, there's not as much asbestos in a home than there is a large industrial facility. So at a chemical plant, at a steel plant, in a paper mill, there's a lot of different asbestos products. In your home, there might be drywall, plaster, ceiling tiles, floor tiles. So there's a lot less so we can often get more compensation for industrial clients. We can still do well for home renovators, things like that.
Okay.
But we're putting in a lot more claims for
Hmm.
industrial work just because the facilities they were full of asbestos. Anything that was hot had to be fireproofed. Um,
Got it.
yeah.
What I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, although given your database, you probably do. I mean, what would like the high water mark be in terms of like a compensation order?
Sometimes we could get over 1 million for, a heavy industry type of client, someone who worked at a steel plant, a paper mill, a power plant, things like that.
Okay.
We're doing, north
Right.
of 1 million in some of these cases.
Okay. And then the other thing I was wondering about, and I'm sure other people are wondering as well, is what about claims through workers' compensation or WSIB or that kind of thing, as opposed to working through the trust that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so you have the option of filing a claim to workers' comp for a work-related injury, including mesothelioma. If you're working with it, you can file the workers' comp, the WSIB in Ontario, or you can hire a lawyer. And you can't do both. You have to pick one or the other. So if you file a claim with the WSIB, then I can't help unless they withdraw the claim, then I can't help. So
Right.
workers' comp in Ontario pays somewhere around 40, 50,000 lump sum. They have a widow's pension. So if you pass away, there's a different pension amount depending on your earnings. They also pay for some funeral expenses and medical expenses if needed. But quite often, when you're over 65, there's not a lot of medical expenses anyway.
Right.
So that's one option, or you hire a lawyer, and we can often get a lot more than they provide. Um, some people would rather just go with WSIB, or sometimes it's too late. They call me 6 months later and say, "Oh, I
Hmm.
have a WSIB claim. Can I hire you?" And
Right.
sorry,
How
too late.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's interesting. It's actually very similar to termination claims, where you can bring a claim to Ministry of Labor or you can bring a claim in Superior Court, but you can't do both. Uh,
right.
and I know you can withdraw your claim from the ministry, but you have a very, very short timeline to do that. How does it work
Mhm.
in your in your context? Like, how long do you have to withdraw the WSIB claim?
It depends on how far along it is. So I've had a client recently, he got a check for 44,000 and then he called me and said, "Is that all my life is worth?" And I said, "No, we could get you way more. This is $1 million claim in your case." So he was able to withdraw it, return the check,
Oh wow.
and we were able to work on it. So,
So
you know,
even where he'd gone through the whole process and gotten a check, he was still able to withdraw.
yes, yeah,
Wow. Okay, so that's yeah, it's totally different than the
yeah.
termination context where if you wait, I think more than a couple of weeks, then you're pretty much out of luck.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you had a check, you deposited it 6 months later, you call me, it's probably too late.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. And I was going to come back. I know we were talking about the trust, and in your bio it mentions that you've had some cross-border recovery from U.S. based trusts. So how does that work? Like, are you teaming up with a lawyer in the States to do that?
So all these trusts are US companies that sold their products in Canada. So
Oh,
Canadians and Americans can put in a claim to the trusts. But occasionally we get clients that worked in the US, and that's where we partner with a law firm in Illinois. There's a few different law firms. And we also have partnerships with a law firm in Scotland and England,
Oh,
and we'll work together with them on the case. And, sometimes they can recover in Scotland if they were working there and in Canada, or same with the US. So in the US, they can sue companies that don't have an asbestos trust if you worked in the
okay.
US. Sometimes if there's a connection with a Canadian company, even if you didn't work in the US, sometimes we can still put in a claim in the US. And it could be 50 different manufacturers, and
Right.
it takes longer, but often pays more. I'll get a handful of clients that worked in the US briefly. Sometimes it's just training, so I always really have to grill them. Did you ever work in the US? No, but I did take a training course or I went to university there. That's enough for us to file a claim in the US as well.
That raises an interesting question. How much exposure do you have to have in
One
order to
day is
calculate
enough for
risk?
mesothelioma.
Oh wow. Okay, I think a lot of people might not realize that, so that's good to know.
Yeah, I mean, there's no safe level. Um, I had a client that, stripped floors in his house, the asbestos floor tiles. And other than that, he was an office worker, so that was his only possible exposure. So it was one day of stripping some floors. I have other clients that were, say, a police officer or a dentist, but as a student, as a summer student job, they worked at a paper mill. And I have a client now. He's passed away, but he was a lawyer, and in his youth, he worked at a construction company, and that's his only exposure. I've had two lawyers actually. Another one worked at a paper mill before he became a lawyer,
Oh,
and yeah.
that's good to know because, like I said, I don't think a lot of people realize that.
Mhm.
I know you also want to talk about sort of modern day risks, and we talked a bit about talc and baby powder and makeup. But are there other current day risks that you wanted to mention?
I'd say the biggest one would be home renovations because a lot of people are doing it themselves and they may not know what is asbestos. They might be knocking down a wall and it's full of asbestos plaster or, vermiculite that's tainted with asbestos. They might be going up in the attic that's full of zonolite attic insulation. There was a mine in Montana and where they mine vermiculite, and it's used as an insulation material, and it's in houses across Canada as attic insulation. So the mine was tainted with asbestos. So all this um, zonolite vermiculite attic insulation was another cause for people
Right.
getting this. But not all vermiculite contains asbestos. It was only certain mines that were contaminated, like the one in Montana.
Okay.
Um, Speaking of which, I've had gardeners that would use this that also have mesothelioma. We had a mushroom farmer, so he would, those potted plants, and they would put this vermiculite in it. It's a
Right.
farming
Yeah.
and gardening product as well. Yeah.
Wow. So this is obviously well it said the workplace, but if someone's going to be doing renovations, what are they supposed to do before they start to avoid this issue?
What can you do, really? You might want to call an expert, or have it tested.
Right.
We recently had floor tiles in our office tested. We were ripping up an old carpet, and we were going to put hardwood in one of the offices, and there was these, 9 by 9 floor tiles. We had them tested at a lab. Our contractor chipped a little piece. Probably not safe, too safe to do. Had it tested, and I think they had 1% asbestos. And certain floor tiles, they have to. You can't use power tools on them because then that's going to create dust. It's called friable. Some asbestos is friable and can crumble and create dust that can go into your lungs. But these floor tiles, they were not friable. So the only thing that the abatement guy did was just say, don't use power. I'm not going to use power tools when we're
Hmm.
taking it out. But for friable asbestos, then you need the guys in hazmat suits and negative air sucking everything out. Um, I keep getting off topic though. Like you'll ask me about one thing and I'll just start telling you a different story.
Yeah,
Well,
well, that's pretty normal
yeah,
because it all connects together, and
yeah,
obviously we could probably talk for 3 hours, and you wouldn't run out of things to talk about. So
yeah.
I wouldn't worry about that. It's actually all quite interesting.
But you
Uh,
were mentioning asbestos products in the home. So,
yeah,
if you're worried that your ceiling tile or your wall might have asbestos in it, it wouldn't hurt to have it tested. I think that's important. But a
okay,
lot of people don't do that and they'll just, start ripping out their fireplace or whatever it
right,
is, and they could incidentally have exposure. Um,
got it.
but asbestos was in everything. They made cigarette filters and baby blankets and gloves and I always hear about something new, even old televisions, asbestos
Oh
wiring
wow,
and irons and you know th- just about everything. The fake snow, like in The Wizard of Oz, that was actually
right.
asbestos. And I think the
That's incredible. Because
scarecrow,
whenever I think of asbestos, I think old building, and it's going to be buried in the
yeah,
walls, which of
but the
course
old
is
fake
totally
snow was
naive.
also, yeah, I think the scarecrow had mesothelioma in the end, and it could have
Oh,
been from
wow.
that. Yeah.
That's wow. That's I did not know that. That's kind of sad
Yeah.
to hear.
We had a
Um,
race car driver once, and he had an asbestos fireproof suit, and it was old and torn, and fibers were coming out of it. So, that was one of his potential exposures. Yeah.
oh,
Speak
that's incredible.
Speaking of which, we can make a claim for all possible exposure. So, say you worked at an industrial facility and you have a lot of exposure there, but you also did a home renovation back in the 70s. We can
Oh,
put in a claim against the company that sold the asbestos drywall materials, as well as all the ones at the industrial site.
that's interesting. So how that type of scenario, how would that be dealt with? Because there wouldn't be a way they could actually determine where
You
what
can't.
caused it, right? So
No, you're
they
never
just
going to know what breath you breathed in that
yeah,
really caused this cancer. But so that's part of the reason we can make a claim for all possible exposure.
right.
Where
And
it
then
gets
how does that
tricky is
get dealt
these,
with? They just kind of divide up the potential liability, or what do they do?
yeah, somewhat. I mean, with the trust claims, we will file, say, 10 claims. They don't speak to each other really, but some of the companies will ask, did you file a claim to other companies? And we will submit details on that.
Got it. Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
But if one company is, 90% of your exposure, if you only dealt with one product, which is pretty rare, then we can apply for extra from these companies.
Okay,
They normally have a scheduled value for a claim. And, if somebody's younger, we'll apply for extra and have the claim reviewed individually. So if you there's a chance they could pay less than the scheduled value, though, if you file an individual review claim. So,
yeah,
say a trust normally pays 50,000 to someone with mesothelioma, you know, if they're 90 years old, we'll apply for expedited review. We won't apply for extra. But if they're 40, we'll
got it.
submit a tax return or, you know, we'll submit additional documents like showing they have children, things like that. And then they'll pay extra, some of these companies. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. And yeah, before we wrap things up, so we've covered a lot. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover we haven't talked about?
I was just thinking about asbestos brakes. So I have a lot of clients that are mechanics or people that did their own brakes at their home. And, up until I think it was the early 80s, there was asbestos brakes. So companies like AC Delco, Bendix, we have claims against these companies. Um, it's just everywhere. I had one client that would mix it with asphalt and pave the roads. And he paved some roads in Peterborough, my town actually.
Right.
Um, but it just made the asphalt stronger. And it's interesting looking up old formulas and recipes of asphalt because they put a little asbestos in there. So every time they're ripping up an old road, I sort of hold my breath when I'm driving by. But everyone here, everyone listening to your podcast, they've had some asbestos exposure. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
But most people don't get cancer from it. So I wouldn't start worrying, but if you did work as a plumber or a pipe fitter back in the 70s and 80s, it doesn't hurt to get screening. Some unions will send all their members for screening, every year, every 6 months, where they do an X-ray, and if they catch a spot on your lung, they can test it, and if it is mesothelioma, then the earlier diagnosis, the more treatment options are available.
Right.
So screening
There
is
is an
important.
interesting point as you're talking about. I hadn't thought about unionized workers who, of course, in many contexts, their legal remedies are limited to working through
Mhm.
the union and the grievance process. But for this type of claim, is there anything blocking them from pursuing the same trust claims that you've been talking about?
No, the union, sometimes they recommend us, sometimes they recommend workers' comp.
Okay.
Sometimes they don't know about us. So we've talked to plenty of unions before, but I hear from people, oh yeah, the union recommended workers' comp. So
Hmm.
it's one of the options, yeah, that they'll
Got it.
give.
Okay, no, that's good to know because in other contexts, such as wrongful dismissals, of course, you're very limited if you're unionized.
Right,
Uh,
yeah.
so that's good for people to know. And my biggest takeaway from this whole conversation is that asbestos is pretty much everywhere because in my mind it was very limited to old buildings.
Mhm.
So before I wrap things up, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
I think the best way is through our website, miskinlaw.ca, miskinlaw.ca. We have a chat on the website. You can talk to the chat. I'll get the message directly, or you can call. Our toll-free number is 877-428-8000. And I'm always available. I make myself available because it's time is of the essence in my claims with everybody not having long to live. Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate that very much. I appreciate the information you brought today, which was quite interesting, and a lot of it was kind of eye opening for me and probably for others as well. So, Daniel, thanks again for agreeing to come on Fire Away.
Yeah. Thank you, Stuart. I appreciate it.
That was great, and that's a wrap for episode 101 of Fire Away. So, I want to thank Daniel Miskin again for being a guest. I want to thank Mark and our production team, as always, for putting everything together. And of course, I want to thank you for watching or listening. Please like, follow, and subscribe. As I mentioned at the beginning, I want to get to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, so please help us do that. Do me a favor if you think about someone else who might enjoy this episode or any of our 100 previous episodes and share it with them. And check out the rest of Rudner Law's social media and sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date on HR law issues. And last but not least, to quote one of my favorite hockey broadcasters, the pleasure was all ours.
At Rudner Law, we want people to treat their employment relationships as legal relationships and make informed decisions rather than assumptions. Keep up to date on Canadian employment law issues by following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok, liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and signing up for our newsletter. Past episodes can be found on YouTube, on our website, and archived on Facebook. And if you like our page or subscribe to our channel, you will receive notifications when the episodes are live. As we always say, none of that replaces legal advice tailored to your specific circumstances. If you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us.